Well, good afternoon and welcome to this afternoon's webinar on COP15. Thank you for joining us today. This is the first of two webinars on, to give it its full title, the Convention on Biological Diversity Conference of the Parties 15. My name is Sally Hayns, I'm the CIEEM CEO, and it's my pleasure to chair this event today. The second webinar will take place next week on Thursday, the 2nd of December. You can book on that webinar through the events tab on the CIEEM website. And we are recording this event and it will be added to our YouTube channel and also to the resources hub on the CIEEM website. So today we're talking about COP15, which of course was originally planned to take place in 2020. We've now had part one of COP15, which was held virtually in October and resulted in the Kunming Declaration. Kunming, of course, being the location in China where COP15 was due and still is due to take place. Indeed, the second part of COP15 will take place there in April and May 22 in person. And it's hoped that at that event, a new Global Biodiversity Framework will be agreed. So the format for today's panel discussion today's discussion will be a panel. We have a really interesting and expert panel here. And we'll be asking them some questions and gathering their thoughts on both where we are today, the state of nature, if you like, today, but also our aspirations for COP15 next year. And then there will be an opportunity to have questions from the audience. So please feel free at any time to put questions in the Q&A function. But if you just want to make a comment, put that in the chat, that's great. If you've actually got a question for the panel, do stick it in the Q&A function. So this is the first webinar and it's focusing on biodiversity threats, conservation and restoration. The second webinar next week will focus on resources, finances and business engagement. So I'd like to introduce today's panel and I'm very pleased to welcome Richard Benwell, who's the CEO of Wildlife and Countryside Link. Isobel Mercer, who's Senior Policy Officer for RSPB Scotland, and Professor James Curran MBE, environmental scientist and former CEO of the Scottish Environment Protection Agency. And I'd be grateful if you would just briefly introduce yourself. So in alphabetical order, Isobel.
Thanks very much, Sally. Did you want us to give our kind of opening thoughts at this point as well, or just introduce ourselves?
Let's do it all. Let's do all in one big bang. So yes, your opening thoughts as well would be great.
Hi everyone. Great to have you all here today. Brilliant to see so many people already kind of gearing up for COP15, even with COP26 just coming to a close. And many thanks to CIEEM for the invitation. So as Sally said, I'm Isobel. I work in the policy and advocacy team for RSPB Scotland, where I lead on kind of nature recovery policy. So today I will probably talk quite a lot about what's happening in Scotland, but actually just for my opening thoughts, I wanted to kick off today by sharing a few thoughts about transformative change. So in 2019, as many of you will know, a landmark report was published, the IPBES Global Assessment on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And this is really going to serve and has served as a scientific basis for the new global framework that will be adopted at COP15. And it found that nature is being lost, as again, most of us know, around the world faster than at any other time in human history, that up to 1 million species currently face extinction within decades. But importantly, the report also found that there's still time to change the fate of nature and our planet, but that this requires transformative change and that is described as fundamental and system-wide reorganization of social, economic and technological systems. So really what the report's telling us is we can't continue to tinker around the edges, looking at individual policies and strategies and laws. We need to kind of really rethink all of the systems that define our lives. So I guess my thoughts are that 2 years on, it's kind of mind-blowing to think about how rapidly and dramatically the context has shifted, not only in terms of the pandemic, but also in terms of a kind of rapid awakening of public attitudes towards climate change and the environment. Just a few weeks ago, we've seen people across nearly all continents over the world marching for the climate. and that we know during the pandemic and the lockdowns, more and more people have really woken up to nature and the key roles that nature plays in our lives, getting more connected with nature in their local areas during lockdowns, but also for some people being really challenged by the fact that they don't have access to nature. So I think that's all critical, and it led to what we kind of saw as a collective rethink or reimagining of our lives, you know, our local places, the places where we live and work, our food systems, supply chains. But I think that maybe now, a year on from lockdown, that maybe that kind of build forward better movement has maybe stagnated slightly, as we're still in limbo waiting to see what's going to happen with the pandemic. Some people's lives are shifting maybe back to something remotely more normal. Some people's lives haven't. And so I think the key thing for me is at this junction between COP26 and COP15 to kind of refocus energies on that need for transformative change and the need to tackle the twin crises as one. So I think partly what the sector has to do is create a vision for people about what a future would look like that's nature positive and net zero. And that kind of vision will help to mobilize people to help create this transformative change that we know is needed. That's my kind of initial.
Thank you very much, Isobel. I mean, some really important stuff there, and I think we're going to be coming back to this need for transformative change and ambition, and how that matches action later on, and also I think the public engagement bit as well, I want to touch on again later. James, I think you're alphabetically next.
Hi there. Yeah, thanks, Sally. It's a real pleasure to be with everyone this afternoon. I'm James Curran, and yes, I retired some years ago, as you can probably tell, as Chief Executive of CIEEM, the Scottish Environment Protection Agency. But I seem to have been just about as busy ever since, doing a whole variety of things. At the moment, I'm a trustee of the Green Purposes Company that oversees the Green Investment Bank, which was privatised some years ago, to try and keep it green now that it is a major private investment bank that operates globally. That's exposed me to the financial world, which was quite revealing as well as interesting. I still advise the Isle of Man government on climate change, and their Climate Change Act is just about, or may indeed have, received royal assent, and that's been absolutely fascinating working with the government on the Isle of Man. And finally, I'm chair of Climate Ready Clyde, which has just published the Climate Change Adaptation Strategy and Action Plan for Glasgow City region, which is about 1/3 of Scotland, quite a big area. So quite a lot that keeps me busy. On this particular issue, just to give a few opening remarks, I feel almost bad about this, because I am obstinately optimistic. You need to be when you work in the environment sector, I think, and perhaps particularly like me, it's been quite a number of years. But equally, I think one has to just be brutally honest, and the 2011-2020 Strategic Action Plan for Biodiversity has totally failed. Not a single HE target has been met. What worries me about COP15 next year in China is that it's more or less just rolling the same targets forward that should have been met in 2020, but move the date. Let's make it 2030. I mean, come on, is it just going to be set up to fail again? In my mind, I've been quite heavily involved in COP26 in my home city, which is where I'm speaking from in Glasgow. Draw some comparisons with the kind of activity around climate change. And my hope for COP26, which I think was realised, was that it would become a cultural tipping point. Whether or not it achieved all the technical aspects that were expected, and in many ways I think it did, my main hope was that it would be a cultural tipping point. And I believe that is genuinely needed now for the nature emergency as well. I was looking up some facts and figures I am a scientist after all, just before coming on. And in 2017, 70% of people in the UK thought that there would be less variety of life over the next 50 years. So, you know, it's not a good starting point, is it? But you know what I mean? There's a basis of understanding there that people recognize we're facing some considerable difficulties. At that time, only 28% in Scotland were very concerned about the loss of biodiversity. That's quite low, because at the same time in 2017, the equivalent for climate change was 40%. So a lot more people concerned about climate change in 2017 than biodiversity. At that time, again, 2017, 19% of people thought that biodiversity was very relevant to them personally, quite a low number. And only 10% would actually get actively involved in speaking to politicians or even signing petitions. You know, there's a real problem there, I think. There's some very recent opinion polls have come out on climate change around COP26, and this is globally across the entire world, a huge public opinion survey. 2/3 of people believe that climate change is a global emergency. 2/3 of the population of the planet. Wow. And in the UK, that's 80% now believe that there's a climate change global emergency. And almost 60% want government to take stronger action. You know, these are huge shifts. And there was an opinion poll published just yesterday for the UK saying that climate change, environment and climate change is now the single biggest issue facing the UK. And, you know, many people believe it's going to be a bigger impact on them than the COVID pandemic. So climate change, I believe, really has reached that kind of cultural tipping point. And I think for biodiversity or to tackle the biodiversity emergency, the nature emergency, whatever you want to call it, we need to really seek out and deliver that same cultural tipping point. And I think we need much simpler messages to get that across. And once you get that cultural tipping point, then it will drive political decisions, and much more than that, national actions that deliver on the ground. And it will also begin to shift private investment, which is where the funding has to come from. Public funding will never deliver on the scale needed to tackle this emergency. I'm sure we'll cover loads of that stuff later on.
We'll come back to it, but thank you for that. And you know, I do absolutely agree. I think we need a really good comms strategy around the biodiversity crisis. And I think we have made quite a lot of progress in making people aware of the loss of biodiversity. What we perhaps haven't done so well is the why it matters. And that's, I think, the thing that we've got to really get across. Richard, follow that.
Thank you so much. For those who aren't familiar with us, Wildlife and Countryside Link are a coalition of 62 environmental charities working on law and policy for wildlife, animal welfare and human health and well-being. And we're focused on England most of the time, but who couldn't pay attention to COP in the run-up to COP15? I think it's probably worth just doing a speedy reminder about what this COP is about before we go any further. So everybody knows that COP26 was about keep 1.5 alive to limit the increase of global temperature to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels on the climate change side. But on the biodiversity side, this is the undercover COP. Nobody knows what it's about. Nobody knows what it's for. So for those who haven't been keeping up with the draft text, and I wouldn't blame you if you hadn't, because it hasn't exactly hit the headlines, this COP is going to aim to create an economy that works in harmony with nature by 2050. And to help get us there, its intention is to have a 2030 mission, hopefully to halt the decline of biodiversity. And there's a whole series of targets, action targets for how to deliver that mission on the way to 2050. And, you know, that sounds spectacularly exciting. Isobel's already talked about the million species at risk of extinction. There are plenty more headlines out there if you need them. The WWF Living Planet report was I hesitate to say a good one, but a startling one recently, with its finding that 68% of species abundance for vertebrates has been lost since 1970. So, you know, these are big numbers. And the mission of COP is, after, let's face it, 2 centuries of steep decline of wildlife, following probably many centuries before that of a gradual frittering away of the natural riches of our world, following that history-long pattern of human destruction of nature, we're finally going to try to take a grip and say, for the first time, for any species that's ever been out there, we're going to anticipate our own destruction through overuse. We're going to grab hold of Malthus and laugh in his face and say, actually, we're not going to go over the top. We're not going to hit tipping points of ecological disaster. We are going to step up as a society to limit our impacts on the earth, to halt decline of biodiversity, and to create a sustainable society. It's hugely exciting. The problem, as James has said, is that it's the 3rd time we've said we'll do it. So the Convention on Biological Diversity has had this aim pretty much since the outset, and most famously with those HE targets to halt biodiversity loss by the turn of this decade. They came and they went, and there was barely a whisper when we missed them all. So the challenge for this COP is coming at it in a way that creates that pinnacle of public attention for an inviolable commitment for the next decade to turn things around, one that people understand and is measurable and hopefully achievable. So previous iterations have been very complex and very woolly. Let's have a really definite one to halt decline and begin to reverse by 2030. And it's one that needs to have the monitoring and actions to help us get there. So that's the key difference between the Biodiversity COP and the Climate COP. Its ability to reach into countries and have an effect on day-to-day lives and influence the decisions of national governments. And that kind of monitoring framework simply hasn't been there for biodiversity in the way that it has for carbon. And to make it happen, this is where organizations like Wildlife and Countryside Link come in. Of course, we need leaders. This is a hugely difficult topic. It brings to the table so many issues of justice and distribution. We're asking people to limit their growth and change their growth pattern in ways that has real impacts on justice and people's livelihoods. And to do that in a fair way, we need leaders to come to the table with answers, with domestic commitments, with a show of responsibility. And that's why in the run-up to COP, we're going to be making darn sure that we highlight where the UK, 4 countries, are doing really well, sometimes on things like target setting, where they're doing better on promises than on delivery, things like 30 by 30, protecting the land and sea, and where they really need to step up to the plate on things like financing. So tremendous potential, really exciting, but as James says, let's not make it 3rd time unlucky. Let's see if we can actually make a difference this time and make it a COP that bites.
Thank you, Richard. So like James, are you an obstinate optimist?
I am, yeah. I mean, it's going to be really hard this time to get what we need out of COP, but I guess what keeps me optimistic is the very fact that we are able to bring hundreds of countries to the global negotiating table to promise change that will have distributional and economic effects on the futures of their countries in order to collectively avert a problem that may not actually come home to roost in individual countries for some time to come. I think it's actually amazing that we can do that in the climate and biodiversity fields. And the trick with biodiversity, of course, is that it's that much more complicated than climate. And as Isobel said, it's going to mean reaching into all sorts of different sectors, from water, development, forestation and land use. That's why it's really hard, but it's amazing, frankly, that we're even trying and we're starting to see the change in some countries that gives us a glimpse of what the future could be like.
Thank you, Richard. If you don't mind, I'm going to stick with you for now, because your opening statements kind of led me into it, really. And that's to say, well, okay, if we put aside for the moment the rather dispiriting inability to meet targets, what, if you look back in sort of the recent last 20, 30 years time in terms of biodiversity, conservation, restoration here in the UK, and looking right across the 4 countries of the UK, what have we done well?
Well, we know that protected sites work. That's a really important message for a couple of reasons. There's really great evidence out there that shows that Natura 2000 SPAs and SACs really do confer better protection for wildlife than equivalent areas of habitat outside those protected areas. They really help to slow the decline and hold on to the best that's out there. That's important for 2 reasons. The first is that one of the most important promises that's coming through for COP15 is this idea of 30 by 30. It's this promise to protect 30% of land and sea for the benefit of wildlife. And the rub here is beginning to define what 30 by 30 means. So there's really good scientific evidence about what an effective protected area looks like. It means legal protection against harm, so no intensive activities, whether it be farming or resource use, that actually are a devil for nature, and positive management requirements, so investment in habitat improvement and maintenance. We know what that looks like. At the moment, we're heading to the table with quite an empty promise when it comes to 30 by 30. So the UK is marking its own homework on its offer of 30 by 30 and saying it's almost there, simply by including AONBs and national parks, which aren't even, they're not even nature conservation designations in the first place. They're landscape and beauty designations. So instead of doing that, we should take this really positive lead that the UK has set by committing to 30 by 30, but be honest about what we need to do to deliver it. And that means extending and improving the protected site network of SACs, SPAs and SSSIs. And the final quick point on that is we're also, now that we're outside the European Union, we're also in a position where for the first time we could actually weaken those protected sites here in the UK, and the government's given itself new powers that could allow it to do exactly that. We should be going in the opposite direction and levelling up SSSIs so they're as strong as Natura 2000. So we know that goes really well. Protected sites really work. What we need to do now is expand out of that protected site network to take action across the rest of the economy and the rest of the landscape.
Thank you. I will come to you, James. I'm just going to ask Isobel the same question, if I may.
Yeah, thanks, Sally. I mean, it's a really good question because it is important to, sometimes we're not always good enough at celebrating success. And I think it's really important to look back at the last few decades and see where we have done things right so that we can scale up those solutions. Although, as Richard and James have rightly highlighted, there's been a lot of gaps and failed targets as well. I think that on a kind of individual project level, so species related projects, site related projects, as Richard said, so individual kind of habitat restoration projects, there's been a lot of amazing delivery work across the UK. And actually a lot of that was funded by the EU LIFE programme, which was kind of the biggest nature fund that was solely directed at nature conservation. So that's, you know, kind of, as Richard was just highlighting, another potential risk or something we need to consider now that we're outside of the EU is replacing that funding. But that did fund a lot of amazing kind of species and habitat work. And I think that the key thing now is, how do we scale and join up that kind of work to deliver at the scale we know is needed? So how can we turn some of those models of successful delivery into ecosystem scale type restoration? And I think we're starting to see some kind of pioneering projects that fit that bill. So for instance, Cairngorms Connect in the Cairngorms National Park is a huge project covering a vast area of the park. It's a partnership between a number of different organisations that's looking at kind of restoring natural processes across a range of different habitats. So I think there's some really kind of pioneering work out there that's going in the right direction, but we need to see more of those kinds of projects kicking off across the whole of the UK. And I guess my final point would also be lesson learning across the 4 countries about where things have gone well. So actually picking up on Richard's example of protected areas, whilst there's a lot of work still to do, and we've certainly kind of stagnated in terms of progress, in Scotland, actually, the protected sites network is in a better condition than protected sites in the rest of the UK. And the statutory nature sites, like the Natura sites Richard mentioned, but also sites of special scientific interest, cover a much larger area of land already. So around 18% of Scotland's land is designated as statutory sites, and around 65% of the species and habitats covered by that network are in favourable condition. So still a lot of work to get that to 100%, but it is doing better. And I think that it can provide some lesson learning about how to deliver some of that site protection and management with partners.
Yeah, very important to share lessons learned. And of course, we mustn't forget the marine environment as well. James.
Yeah, Isobel expressed very well what I was going to qualify Richard's remarks with. Yeah, the protected sites and species, I mean, by definition, legally, they protect a particular site for a limited list of features, or they protect individual species. And yes, it works, but you know, the recent ecosystem assessment for the UK, I know the figures quite well in Scotland. I think it's 45% of ecosystem services in Scotland are declining. I mean, by definition, that is totally unsustainable. And the only ones that are really doing any good at all are the provisioning ones, you know, timber production, agricultural production, and so on. So individual protection we show can work, but the entire ecosystem is collapsing outside of that. And what has been very formative in my thinking around this is a review paper of 5 huge experiments, one in each continent right across the world, that were run for about 50 years, looking at the impact on biodiversity and the associated ecosystem services of fragmentation. So either changing the shape through development, obviously, land management development, changing the shape of a natural habitat, or breaking it up into discrete parts, or shrinking it in size. And these experiments consistently show really damaging long-term effects on ecosystem service provision. I mean, huge effects that last for many, many decades. So, you know, the converse of that is we really must, exactly as Isobel was saying, get into the way of thinking that we need not just to protect sites, but to protect their connectivity, and remove that defragmentation that is absolutely wrecking our ecosystem service provision, which underpins everything we need for our continued success and a successful and happy life. So yeah, for me, it's about that connectivity. I'll leave it there at the moment. I'm sure we'll come back.
It's a very good point. I think there's very broad recognition of the importance of ecological connectivity, perhaps less actual delivery in practice though, and that's something we do need to focus on. Before we turn to COP15, I just wanted to reflect on COP26 and get your thoughts on, has COP26 delivered anything for nature, or potentially deliver anything for nature? What's your perspectives on COP26? I'm not going to come to you individually. I'm just going to let you indicate if you'd like to answer that question. Isobel, thank you, and then James.
Thanks, Sally. Yeah, I think this is a really important kind of moment of reflection, actually, because I completely agree with the comments that were made earlier around the kind of public awakening on climate has been, and mobilization on climate has kind of outstripped public awareness and understanding of the nature crisis. And there's a lot of work to do, I think, to give the nature crisis the same public understanding and weight and momentum that the climate crisis is receiving. But I think that actually, despite what's rightly been kind of heralded as quite a disappointing outcome of COP26 overall, in terms of the kind of dilution of move away from fossil fuels, on nature, there was quite a lot of progress. And I think it was really brilliant to see that Nature had a much bigger profile in terms of some of the events that were happening at some of the high-level talks, but also managed to appear in the text itself to a much greater extent than has happened in some of the other climate COPs. So I think that it is an area where we can highlight some progress was made. So, for example, one of our key asks was explicit recognition of the role of nature in keeping 1.5 alive, and that was achieved within the text. And there was a few other kind of key mentions of nature in the mitigation sections, recognition of the role of terrestrial and marine ecosystems, and various other references throughout. So yeah, that's something that we've really welcomed, and we hope that will provide a good bridge through to COP15 to kind of keep that momentum going.
James, did you think at COP26, there was a really good understanding about the sort of integration of the nature emergency and the climate emergency? Do you think that came across in terms of some of the outcomes?
I think it could have been very much stronger, but I think it will be at future COPs. I mean, as Isobel said, in the so-called Glasgow Climate Pact, which was the document that was widely covered in the media, and it does make fairly strong mention of that connectivity between the nature emergency and the climate emergency in both directions, driving each other either positively or negatively. So it will come back in future, definitely, because to my mind, COP26 did work in several respects, but one of the largely unreported successes was around the adoption of Article 6, which to the nerds of us is very important because it stops double counting of reductions in carbon emissions, which was a real risk left over from the Paris Agreement. But even more importantly, it commits nations to reporting every 2 years on their climate activity against a standard format, and it will be peer reviewed. That is really beginning to hold countries to account. There's no enforcement mechanism and no penalty mechanism, but when you're dealing with 193 independent countries around the world, that's not surprising. But that's a really important feature of climate change action going ahead, and it will ensure, I believe, from next year's COP in Egypt, a ratcheting up of ambition from all nations, because there's nowhere to hide now. And we certainly need the equivalent for biodiversity. I reflect on one thing, which to me is quite a nice story, but Tessa Tennant, who was a well-known sustainable financier, she got some of her friends together in her house in the south of Scotland, not far from where I am now, in the aftermath of COP Copenhagen, which was a disaster. And they sat round her kitchen table reputedly and discussed what's gone wrong. And their conclusion was about the message. It was too complicated, too easy for people to hide behind rhetoric and technicalities. And they came up with the concept of net zero. Now, net zero embodies the ecosystem, the biodiversity element. That's what the net is all about, the sequestration. To me, the most important ecosystem service that nature provides for us at this point in our history anyway. But what a wonderful concept that was, net zero. And now that is embodied totally in COP26. We need, to go back to what I said earlier, a COP15 equivalent. And why shouldn't it just be zero extinctions? I know the ecologists and the other two will probably haul me up for that because there's always a small background rate of extinction, but who cares? Let's have a good strong message, zero extinction 2050.
Thank you. I mean, that leads us nicely. It's gone then, Richard. I was going to.
Sorry, just a few thoughts on COP26 very quickly. I mean, the first and most important thing that COP26 did for nature is keep hope of averting dangerous climate change alive. I think that's worth saying, because climate change remains the biggest risk to biodiversity of them all, and it may be a slim, as they say, life support that the climate talks are on, but at least the hope is still there. So that's good. I mean, I don't share the positivity about the outcome for nature from COP in itself. I mean, yes, there were references to the importance of nature in mitigation that might encourage a few more countries to include nature in their national contributions, but really there was nothing that actually bites. The cross references between the two COPs don't actually do anything. So I think, you know, the UK government went into it quite strongly in rhetorical terms, talking about nature, and that's been helpful. But there's a massive way to go to actually bridge the effort between the two COPs that's required to make one contribute to the other. And also there are more risks on the agenda too, I have to say, that come from some interpretations of nature-based solutions. So there is an alacrity from some countries and from some conservationists to chalk up carbon credits for sequestration activities in order to get money flowing into nature through carbon markets, simply because there's such a dearth of genuine nature finance. Absolutely, we should be investing in nature-based solutions to climate change, but the rush seems to be towards marketizing that and going back to the old way of looking at offsets. We know here in the UK, the government is thinking about that as an option for the UK emissions trading system. And that spectre loomed large at COP26 as well. And that's something we need to be really careful about, because the worst thing would be if, in our rush to save nature, we actually handed industrial emitters a ticket to keep doing what they're doing. So that link across needs to be taken very carefully. And although I share James's pleasure that some progress has been made on Article 6, that's another area where the old demon of hot air credits has been unleashed. This isn't strictly to do with nature, it's more to do with the zombie credits that have been left over from the old emissions trading systems, which allow a lot of countries a lot of extra headroom when it comes to their emissions reduction targets. So there are some big risks there too.
Absolutely. I want to we're going to focus next week on sort of financing and resourcing, and I suspect this this whole discussion around trading platforms and so on is going to come up again. But let's focus now on COP15. We've got the Kunming Declaration already published. We've got the draft Global Biodiversity Framework. In terms of ambition, are they ambitious enough? Do they gladden our hearts and you know, help us to put our shoulder to the wheel? What's your thoughts on what we've got so far in relation to COP15? And that's for anybody to jump in and grab that one. James.
Yeah, does it gladden the heart? I mean, there's loads of good stuff in there, isn't there? I mean, there's absolutely nothing in there that well, I would disagree with, but you know, I think there's an awful lot missing. And you could say, well, maybe it's stuff that should be in COP26, but it's not there either. So I would hope that COP15 really grabs hold of it. I mean, at the opening, Richard quite rightly said that the kind of mission statement is living in harmony with nature. And he went on to say that that means we would have a truly sustainable economy that ran alongside nature and so on. Well, you know, I don't see anything in COP15 that addresses that kind of element. To me, a really important feature, and it is, as I said, a feature of COP26 It's a feature of climate mitigation. It's a feature of climate adaptation as well. And boy, is it a feature of the biodiversity crisis, is to adopt a truly circular economy. I mean, you'll tell me if I'm wrong, but I'm sure I saw a figure somewhere that 90% of the decline in biodiversity can be attributed to our extraction of raw materials from the planet and its downstream processing. That struck me as, I don't know how sound that figure is, but boy, there's some huge impact in there related, as Richard said earlier, very much to our kind of economic system and the way we run our businesses globally. So, you know, I would love to see COP15 go that step further and really grasp the nettle of how we restructure our economic system so that it minimizes its impact on biodiversity. And that is not impossible. People might think, no, you're arguing for the impossible. Well, no, I don't believe so. A company that really inspires me, and believe me, I have no interest in this company whatsoever, is Interface, which is a global billion-dollar company which makes most of the world's carpet tiles. Why am I bumbling on about this? But the carpet tile is such a fantastic, sustainable design itself. You just replace one carpet tile, you don't have to replace your entire fitted carpet, which will then no doubt go to landfill. So the fundamental design concept is great, but then, you know, the founder of that company dared to imagine that he could have zero environmental impact in his global business by 2020. It has very nearly made that. And his successors, because he's dead now, have dared to imagine that they will become a regenerative company. They will create what are called forest factories, which will put more back into nature than it takes out. This is a model of a hugely successful global company producing products that we all want and use. And it is actually a regenerative company putting back into nature. This is what COP15 should be grappling with, amongst many other things.
Isobel. Yeah.
Thanks, Sally. Yeah, I mean, I think on the whole, I agree with James. Does it gladden the heart? Well, not quite, I don't think. And again, it's not that there's anything wrong with what's in there. I don't disagree with any of it. It's warm, welcome words, but I think the problem is that it is just kind of nice words at this point, and it all really hinges on what's actually in that framework, because it's welcome that that ambition and kind of high level commitment is there from world leaders, but what we want to know is how are they going to translate that into real tangible action that has timescales, delivery plans, resources attached to it, and so that's what we need to see in the Global Biodiversity Framework is see some of that warm words and ambition translated into something that's much more specific and tangible, because as was mentioned earlier, that's what the global framework completely failed to do last time around, was to be kind of specific and measurable enough for countries to then go away and implement those targets in a way that would work for their countries, but also to have enough resources and kind of momentum and impetus behind the implementation of those targets. So yeah, I think it's welcome, but it's kind of to be seen how that actually translates into action. And similarly, we had the Edinburgh Declaration last year, which was signed up by subnational governments led by the Scottish Government, which again had a lot of welcome words in. There's a lot of welcome ambition, but we need to see how that's then going to translate into domestic action here in Scotland and the rest of the UK by those subnational governments.
Thank you, Isobel. I mean, coming to you, Richard, to reflect on the same question, but maybe you could also sort of follow that through in terms of national targets. Do we know what we need in terms of national targets? Are we clear enough, or are we leaving up to politicians to work out?
No, we're not clear enough. I mean,
it was a leading question, to be fair.
It was, and the answer is absolutely right. I mean, just before I turn to the question of targets, I'm absolutely loving the way that James and Isobel are rewriting the Convention on Biological Diversity into a convention on just being great, but by which I mean sort of the clear need to move beyond a GDP-focused growth economy that measures success by how much oil you dig up and then burn. I mean, it's just startlingly apparent that that's now a daft way of measuring our success as a society. Unfortunately, I don't think that at this stage, CBD is going to be in a position to tackle that one. But there's no doubt that, well, in my mind at least, that the logic follows through from the 2050 mission to that sort of conclusion. And that it's really important for countries like the UK, where we have benefited from that growth model to have a rich and a relatively affluent society. It's absolutely incumbent on us to set a lead for thinking about how we shift away from that planet destroying model towards one that actually invests in a society that makes us richer in nature. And although the headlines of CBD are about biodiversity, you absolutely can't get there without doing the Kate Raworth and without looking at that donut of planetary resources and looking at how we're already using several planets worth in our global footprint, if you want to use the WWF lingo on that one. So wonderful ambition, and that I hope is where eventually it will lead. At the moment, this convention is more narrowly focused on biodiversity, and the targets in there have actually taken a step back. So since the zero draft of the text, we've actually seen a weakening of the proposed treaty in terms of its specificity for nature. So originally those words about halting and beginning to reverse an index of biodiversity in terms of species abundance were in the text. In the most recent draft, they're not. So we're actually looking at a weaker outcome than we need to, and it's really important that the aspiration that Kunming talks about in rhetorical terms, to halt and begin to reverse biodiversity loss, is placed in the text of the next bit of the CBD in a way that's smart and measurable, that says we're going to have an index of species abundance and it's going to be on the up by 2030. That really is core mission for the next 10 years. I have great sympathy with James's point on extinctions as well. There's already a goal in there to reduce the rate of extinctions by 10%. That's clearly not enough. I think no extinctions would be ambitious, but maybe no anthropogenic extinctions might be getting towards more realistic. So what do we have to do for individual countries? Well, at the moment, this is one area where the UK is doing really well, and we were delighted that Westminster set a clear target in the Environment Act to halt the decline of species by 2030. Thanks to everyone who campaigned with us on that. And the other countries of the UK are also talking about it. There's been a motion in the Welsh Parliament. I think framework of targets is in the coalition agreement, cooperation agreement in Scotland. So it's on the way in the UK. And we need to use the leverage that gives us to make sure that's translated into a text for COP15 in a way that's measurable and divisible into country actions and sector actions below that.
Thanks, Richard. James, you indicated you'd like to chip in here.
Richard was quite right to give me a yellow card for rewriting the CBD. I hope it's not a red card and I get sent off. But you know what occurs to me? It doesn't fall within the remit of COP15. I think it probably could well fall within the remit of COP26, but they've chosen not to do it. But COP15 could send out a call to the World Trade Organization to get a grip on this. The World Trade Organization is not part of the UN, so it's not connected either to COP26 or COP15, but they sit there controlling world trade and embedding long-term damaging subsidies and demanding continuously lower border tariffs and globalization of the economy, which is at least very much in part driving much of the damage that is being done to biodiversity. And the EU is considering carbon border adjustments, which is a carbon tax, if you like, at its frontiers, so that it will prevent offshoring of carbon emissions and importing cheap, heavily carbon embedded products into Europe without some sort of financial penalty. The same kind of thing should be applied to damage to biodiversity and destruction of ecosystem services. And what is the WTO doing? Nothing that I can see.
Thank you. You've kind of neatly led us on to something that I hope Isobel will pick up in thinking about, okay, we can have targets, we can monitor progress towards those targets. We know often quite a way in advance that we're not going to meet our biodiversity targets. We knew we weren't going to meet our HE targets, for example. We're doing monitoring. Are we doing enough enforcement? Isobel, over to you.
Thanks, Sally. And if you don't mind me just very briefly coming back to just one of Richard's points, things we were chatting about the text of the latest draft of the global framework. I mean, just to say that I completely agree that it's been watered down since the last version, and coming back to the earlier point from James about simplicity of language and the fact that we need a kind of equivalent of net zero for nature, I would argue that absolutely yes. And what that is nature positive, which is exactly what Richard was saying around the need to halt and reverse the loss of nature by 2030, ensure that it's actually measurably recovering and recovering substantially by 2050. So I think that that's a useful kind of simpler message that we can all get behind for this COP. On the question of enforcement, no, I would argue there's not enough. So, I mean, thinking specifically of some examples in Scotland to give it a bit of context, coming back to protected areas. So, as we've talked about, we know that protected areas work when they're effectively implemented and funded to protect nature, but a lot of the time they're not effectively managed, and there's not enough resourcing for monitoring as well. But the enforcement powers is also an issue. So we know that in Scotland, Nature Scot has been a bit reluctant to use some of their enforcement powers to improve the condition of protected areas. So things like land management orders and restoration orders have either not or very, very rarely been used as a vehicle for achieving favourable condition. And actually, in part, that comes back to a resourcing question, because you can't offer a land management order, you can't use a land management order unless you've already offered a management agreement, and that's kind of not worked out, then you can move on to use a land management order. So I guess to us that brings into question, are there enough resources for Nature Scot to be offering management agreements for landowners who own and manage these sites? So it kind of often comes back to this question of resources tied up with enforcement, I think. But that's certainly an area where we need to see much more kind of stronger enforcement in order to ensure effective delivery moving forward.
Thank you, James.
Yeah, as I've said a couple of times, I'm a natural born regulator. I love regulation because it can act very, very quickly and is actually pretty cheap. It's pretty economically efficient. And, you know, I mean, okay, maybe it's a joke, but I think there's something serious in an argument to begin to introduce ecosystem-based regulation at particular points in the economic cycle. If you buy or sell a house, you can't do it these days without an EPC, an energy performance certificate. Well, why not when you buy and sell land, maybe above a de minimis size? you also have to have an EPC, which would be an Ecosystems Performance Certificate. We have the technology to do it. I used to be closely associated with the James Hutton Institute. I know they can do all of this kind of modeling and come up with numbers about ecosystem performance relative to the potential for that parcel of land. Now, you may think, well, at the moment, that would just be an interesting kind of number, which you have to provide at the point of sale and that you would know about at the point of purchase. But it begins to drive maybe a change of mindset, and it opens up the opportunity actually of introducing some sort of economic regulation attached to that. One example might be WAGO, which is attached to farm tenancy in Scotland. I don't know, presumably there's something similar in England, where the tenant of a farmer, when he gives up that tenancy, gets some money back if he's invested in the farm, putting up basically tin sheds and things like that. Well, why not get some money back if he's also improved the ecosystem service provision of that parcel of land that he's been farming for some years? You know, that would be so easy to include in the existing legislation. So let's think smartly and cleverly and start shifting the boundaries.
Thank you, Richard. You're on mute, Richard.
Thank you. A couple of quick thoughts on enforcement. I mean, you need to do it at all sorts of different levels, don't you? You need to do it in terms of domestic harm, in terms of national action, and in terms of global corporate supply chains. And there's actually some progress on each, and I want to give some credit to the government here for some steps it's taken on this. So, for example, the new announcements about disclosures of nature-based harm in the financial system following the sort of carbon disclosure requirements are very good that came out around the budget. And the other thing that the government's doing in the Environment Act is requiring due diligence from companies to look at their supply chains to see whether they are dealing in deforestation commodities. So whether global supply chains around things like leather and cocoa and beef are, for example, causing deforestation in the Amazon, and having a legal requirement for companies to do due diligence to avoid harm to biodiversity around the world, and sanctions in place for companies that are found to be contributing to those global harms is absolutely fundamental. It doesn't go far enough. It's based on legality. So it's based on a company obeying the laws of the third country rather than based on sustainability. But it's a really big step forward, and getting those domestic laws in place to follow supply chains through, so this doesn't just end at our borders, is hugely important. But within borders is hugely important too. And I'll probably regret that this is being recorded at some point, but it feels like that environmental damage is something that companies can get away with relative impunity still, even in a country like the UK. I mean, I could not, when first it came out, I couldn't believe my ears when I heard about the defeat devices on VW cars that were changing the statistics from for real world emissions of particulates. I mean, that was absolutely shocking, but it happens in other sectors too. We're just seeing water companies being taken to task by the Environment Agency and Ofwat because they've suddenly reported, when the monitoring requirements come in, that actually they're quite well aware that there've been sewerage overflows going beyond the permitted amounts. And in an area that's really important for your members too, I wouldn't be surprised if there is a similar scandal waiting to happen in terms of the built environment and development, and the sometimes flagrant disregard for environmental conditions that we see in everyday developments around the country. And the need for more, better, independent ecologists out there on the ground checking that things like net gain requirements are actually followed through and that habitat promises are delivered is absolutely essential for the local enforcement and the public scandal that will drive this international change. And the final thing, of course, is the country level, and we need to make sure that when countries are missing their targets, that the global opprobrium is there to put political leverage on. So lots to do.
Well, you provided me with another link, a great link to my last question, but certainly going back to that local enforcement, I know our position was very much that we'd like to see the environmental equivalent of a buildings inspector in local planning authorities that has to go out and check that environmental conditions have been met. But you provided me with a great link to thinking about public engagement, which was mentioned earlier, and the importance of public engagement in both applying political pressure in relation to measures to tackle the biodiversity crisis, but also, you know, potentially active engagement. So I'd welcome your thoughts as a panel on how do we achieve that greater level of public engagement and moving from awareness to understanding to action, which we, you know, that we need, and also how do we make sure that our public engagement work is truly inclusive? So who'd like to pick up on that? Isobel, thank you.
I can start, and then the others can hopefully fill this picture, because I think there's a lot we could say under that topic. But I think for me, there's two key bits. One, that we've already talked about this, but awareness and understanding of the scale of nature loss and why it's happening is still not quite there yet. It's kind of growing, but we do need to help people to better understand. I mean, I think one of the problems with this is what's called shifting baseline syndrome, which I think you'll all be aware of, but this idea that every new generation comes to see what's actually a degraded environment as a new normal, and therefore our kind of collective understanding of how much nature there should be out there completely shifts over time. And something that's come out over the last 18 months is the Biodiversity Intactness Index, which was an analysis carried out by the Natural History Museum. And this basically looks at areas of degraded habitat and then compares those areas with a comparable area of basically pristine habitat that's had little human influence. And then when you compare the two, you get a measure of how intact the degraded environment's biodiversity remains. And the UK countries have done really badly in this league table. So out of 240 territories and countries, Scotland came 28th from the bottom. I think England was 7th from the bottom, and I'm sorry, I don't have the other two right in front of me, but all of them were kind of really at the bottom of the league table. So I think that actually that as a narrative tool can help us to understand that a lot of this loss is historical. And then on top of that, we're continuing to see declining trends now. And I think that we can use that as a narrative tool to not only speak to people about what we've lost from the past, but actually how much we have to regain as well. So I think we can kind of flip it on its head and say, okay, this is the situation, but we've still got all these amazing habitats in Scotland. We've got kelp forest, otters, dolphins, Caledonian pine woods, all these amazing places. Aren't they great? But look how much we've lost. So think about how much better and more vibrant and thriving our world could be if we restored those places and climbed back up that Biodiversity Intactness Index. So I think there's something there around creating a narrative for people about a positive future that has more nature in it and giving them tangible examples about what that would bring to their lives. So when we talk about nature-based jobs, what are those jobs? Are they meaningful work? Are they long-term? What are the kind of contracts? Where might they be? These are questions that we know some of the answers to, but probably not all. And likewise, how will it improve people's health in cities? How can it help to make rural economies and communities more resilient over time to the changes that we're going to see over the next century? So yeah, I think there's definitely something about building a narrative, and I'll probably stop there and let the other two come in on some of the other elements of the question.
James.
Yeah, really interesting question, and I would not pretend for a second to be knowledgeable at all about community engagement or community outreach. But I was very interested in what Richard said in his closing remarks on the previous question about local regulation and so on, and also tying that to what Isobel was saying about communities no longer knowing what biodiversity should actually look like. Because it seems to me, and I very often do come at this from the climate change end, that climate change mitigation, taking actions to reduce our emissions, are very rapidly going to become more either personal or community-based, and preferably community-based. If you think about the need for getting rid of our individual gas boilers and having you know, a tenement heating system or district heating. When it comes to personal transport, we need to think about local public transport and so on. So, and almost by definition, climate change adaptation that I'm closely involved in is locally defined. It has to be. So there's great opportunities here, I believe, for connecting our forthcoming climate actions, both on mitigation and adaptation, to the nature emergency. I'm an ambassador for Glasgow National Park City. It doesn't immediately occur that Glasgow should be a national park city, but the thinking behind that is absolutely the kind of stuff that Isobel was mentioning. Glasgow has a lot of vacant and derelict land, and it would be lovely to see that being developed by local communities, at least most certainly co-designed, co-developed, co-delivered by communities, to adapt to climate change, to use for, you know, heavy rainfall soakaways, green spaces, pop-up cafes, connected pathways to get to public transport, etc., etc. I mean, the list goes on and on. These are wicked problems. They need wicked interconnected solutions. But that would begin, hopefully, to get communities much more involved in the whole climate change argument, but the whole biodiversity and nature argument, and they begin to see from these green spaces what nature can really be like. And we know it can be fabulous.
I'm really loving the idea of wicked solutions. Richard.
Me too. I mean, wicked solution would just be to get these guys on a telly program every day talking about it, because I'm enjoying it tremendously. I guess three ways to do it, to popularize it. The first is to reiterate this local point, capture people's outrage, you know, and so we've seen it with the water pollution recently. And we've seen it with things like Clean Air London. When you show people the everyday damage that's happening close to them, around in their lives, that there's a huge public outcry, and the trick is linking that through to what the policy means, making sure that we as NGOs and campaigners and as an environment movement relate to that issue that people see with the hedge being grubbed up illegally down the road from them, to a global scale crisis. And we're the glue that says, and so government must do this, so we must regulate, so we must take action. So channeling that sort of public outrage. And many of our members are doing that actually now, and sort of finding again their campaigning zeal from the bottom up. The second is that, like it or not, change often happens when you get winners at the corporate level. And one of the things that is, I think, often underappreciated around net zero is how much companies have been amplifiers of that message as soon as frankly they saw a marketing advantage to do so. I'm sure that the good people in those companies want to do it for the right reasons too, but it's when you start getting first mover advantages that you start seeing the likes of Co-op and M&S and Iceland and many others starting to retell these messages, and it's when the boardroom has to start thinking about nature positive in the same way as it does net zero. We get the regulatory system right, that means that good guys are rewarded and the polluter pays. That's when it starts being fed through marketing and reaches a whole lot more people than it would have done through us alone. And finally, I guess, politicizing it and making sure that At the moment, there's no regular parliamentary accountability for nature in the same way that there is for carbon. And we should have an annual moment of a nature budget in exactly the same way as we see the carbon budget. And this is something that we need to really nail in the UK now that we've got these new environmental improvement plans. All of us should be making sure that we hold our decision makers to account at the dispatch box for it every year in a way that generates some political competition. Add those together and you start getting a real appetite for change, I think.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Well, we have got a few questions in. I would like to move on to the audience's questions. So Jason, could you share some of the questions with the panel, please?
Thanks very much, Sally. I think it's been a really interesting conversation so far. Yeah, we've got a few questions that have come in, so I'll run through those. First one is around whether the UK having now left the EU, do we still have the same kind of influence, and what kind of influence will we have at COP15 and over the Global Biodiversity Framework?
Who would like to tackle that one? Go on then, James.
Just very briefly, lay my cards on the table. I greatly regret leaving the EU. The UK had a fantastic track record in influencing EU environmental regulation. It was in the driving seat for years and brought, I believe, good sense and appropriateness to a lot of environmental regulation. So I think it's a great pity in that respect alone. There may be lots of others that we've left. And the EU, of course, has enormous global influence and power, which I simply can't see the UK replicating. Although, to be fair, during COP26, the EU was criticised for being rather low profile. I don't know quite why that was, whereas, of course, the UK had very high profile being in the presidency. So you could argue completely against what I've just said. But in general, I'm a great believer in being part of something bigger and wielding, I believe, the kind of leading thinking around environment that the EU has shown for many years. Maybe not as rapid progress as many of us, of course, and I'm sure the other panelists would agree that we would like, but it's been a force for good on environment.
Any counter views from Isobel or Richard?
Not so much a counter view. The fact is that global multilateral negotiations happen in blocks. You get the blocks of small island developing states, the G20, the G40, the EU, the BRIC countries, and the UK is going to have to work really hard if it wants to be one of those precious few that can exert global influence by itself, or else it's going to have to find itself a home with partners to work with. So I'm not disagreeing with the idea that the UK could do a lot through the EU, but it is worth saying that UK legislation can and often does set a pattern for the world in its own right. So the Climate Change Act is the obvious example of a model that's been replicated around the world. And there are some big opportunities now that folk will be watching. The departure from the EU means that we are reshaping our agricultural policy, which of course is 75% of our land, which of course is going to be critical to delivering change for biodiversity. We can't do it without farmers and land managers. At the moment, the scale of ambition for the sustainable farming incentive and the absence of a well-articulated future regulatory baseline that describes a really sustainable agroecological farming future means that we're at risk of losing a really important opportunity to set a global change. And one thing that we haven't talked about is the importance of justice and social change that goes with the change that's needed for biodiversity, and getting farming right paying farmers for doing the right thing and doing it bravely and effecting transformation in a way that's different from the way we did it with the mines, you know, bringing people along with us in a just transition is a really important pattern that the government here could set if it's brave about the farming transformation in the next few years.
Thank you. Could we have another question? If you don't mind, Isobel, we'll move on to another question so that we try and get through as many as we can.
Yeah, so we've got two I'll put together here that are sort of interrelated on the messaging, simple messaging that James and others covered. So one's around the fact that people around the world can see the impacts of climate change quite clearly. So fires, drought, heat waves, rising sea level, but they don't really see the impact of biodiversity loss on their everyday lives. So how do we make that clear to them? And then sort of linked to that is how do we use the Dasgupta review to communicate the financial importance of biodiversity to people?
Isobel, are you happy to pick that one up in the first instance?
Yeah, I mean, I think on the first question, it's an excellent one that we've kind of covered in various guises, but I think it again comes back to providing tangible examples for people about implications for their daily lives. So both global examples and more local examples as well, and kind of continuing to hammer home the completely interconnected nature of the climate and nature crises, and that actually sometimes it might not be that easy to distinguish between the kind of effects of rising temperatures and more extreme weather events and the degradation and loss of ecosystems. So I think it is all tied up, but we need to do more to communicate to people about the fact that those things are completely interrelated. And sorry, the other part of the question was around the Dasgupta review, and so again, I think when it comes to the economic stuff, I was going to mention what Richard had just said, which the just transition isn't something we touched on that much, and actually it's something that I think people associate more directly with kind of end to oil and gas, but it very much applies as well to kind of nature dependent sectors like agriculture, fisheries, other rural economies. So I think again there's a story to tell there about what are the impacts of these crises going to be on some of those economies, and if we don't create the change we know is needed, because they're right at the kind of forefront of these crises and will most acutely feel the impacts of things like temperature rise and less healthy soils, more extreme weather events. But we also know they have an absolutely critical role to play in helping to address these crises. So we know that there needs to be huge changes in many of those sectors, and that will affect jobs and livelihoods. So that needs to be done in a way that's just and fair and planned. So that work needs to start now. And there's some good kind of movement in Scotland on setting up a just transition commission, but it's not really moving fast enough from the point of view of nature dependent sectors. So I think, again, that's some of the stories that we can tell around the kind of economic side of things.
I'm sure we'll pick up more on the Dasgupta review next week, but James, if you've got a quick point that you'd like to make.
Yeah, I hesitate to contribute, but I can't hold myself back because we may disagree. We may disagree on this one, which is absolutely fine. But Dasgupta, to my mind, pulled its punches. It didn't really hit home. I mean, the logical conclusion of Dasgupta to me, which it didn't say, was that we should have a system of paying for ecosystem service use. I mean, I remember raising that many years ago because running an environment protection agency, which charges those who emit to the atmosphere or discharge into the river a license fee, which is always quoted as polluter pays. Well, it absolutely isn't. All that is doing is recovering the costs of the monitoring associated with it, and no way is that polluter pays. And I've argued for many years that our economy should pay for ecosystem service use, for drawing on ecosystem services. And you may think, well, that's crazy, but it's not, and it already happens. Almost without noticing, the government took ownership to itself of the electromagnetic spectrum, radio bandwidths, if you like, and then charged an absolute fortune to mobile phone companies to use them. That is using an ecosystem service. To me, there is absolutely no difference. So I think we could very easily develop systems which would allow for one way or another, and there isn't time to go into it, businesses that trade on our natural environment to pay in order to maintain that natural environment and its ecosystem service functions. And that would, I think, disincentivize companies to draw excessively on those ecosystem services and therefore damage them. But it would also generate funding that could go into protecting and restoring them.
Thank you very much. Jason, any further questions?
We do have a few more. We've got a quick one for James, was just asking about a reference for the global scale ecosystem services paper that you mentioned earlier. And I think that was about the fragmentation and connectivity research that was done across the continents. If you have that to hand, we can probably put that in the chat maybe.
Wow, I wish I did. And as I was saying it, somebody might ask that. I can certainly track it down. And maybe, Sally, if I send it to you,
that'd be great. If you send it to myself, we'll get it circulated.
I promise to do that. Yeah.
Thank you. Going back to so Richard, you mentioned beyond GDP. We've got a question here from Greg around what does the panel think about the chances of achieving circular economies whilst predominantly Western economies continue to promote rife consumption? How do we address consumption patterns? Do we need to address consumption patterns before real change can take place? We covered this a little bit, but this is a question that's been posed.
I mean, yeah. And it is a matter of shifting consumption and thinking about what we value. I mean, you can consume services in a way that doesn't deplete natural resources, in a way that also creates happiness and economic growth, if you like. And we can grow intellectual capital and environmental capital without thinking that we need to move backwards. But yes, rife resource consumption is absolutely at the heart of this, and mechanisms like extended producer responsibility, where you make sure that the person who's putting all that pointless packaging onto the market pays for it to be cleaned up. So important. But setting ambitious goals for raw resource use has got to be part of this message. And that's why when the Environment Act here in the UK was considered, we were aiming for biodiversity targets to be the sort of pinnacle of a pyramid of targets, because you absolutely can't expect that we'll ever turn around the decline of biodiversity properly unless you're also tackling air, water, waste, resource use as part of that creation of a sustainable society. So we offshore such a lot of consumption that the rich West countries have absolutely got to set a lead on changing this. So I agree with the point of the question. Yeah.
Thank you. Is that the last of the questions, Jason, or any more?
There is one more, an interesting one actually around. So Louise, who teaches ecology and conservation to undergrads and postgrads, says there's a dearth of opportunities for young people entering the job market beyond short-term placements. So is interested in whether COP15 can be seen as creating opportunities for the next generation. Is this something we could perhaps build on?
Oh, I'd love to answer that one, but I'm going to not do the tread on the panel's toes. Would anybody like to comment on that, James?
Yeah, that's a lovely question. And in my lifetime, I've seen environment in all its guises and in all its manifestations grow and grow and rise in public importance and in political importance. And from our discussion, you can see that it connects intimately. These are wicked problems. It connects intimately with society and with the economy. It's everywhere. So I mean, I think it's an absolutely brilliant career to follow. Well, I wouldn't I? But yeah, I know that quite often when you're starting out these days, you do need to do quite a lot, you know, almost sometimes for no pay whatsoever. You need to volunteer, you need to demonstrate your commitment, you need to have something of a track record, and that's tough. I know that's tough, don't get me wrong. But I often, when I'm talking to students and so on, talk about the concept of ikigai, which is, to me, it's a personal version of sustainable development. Sustainable development, you have the three overlapping circles of economic benefit, social benefit, and environmental benefit, and sustainability is that tiny little zone in the middle. Ikigai is the same, but at the personal level. It's doing a job that you love, it's doing a job that you're good at, and it's doing a job that somebody will pay you for. And if you're in that overlapping zone in the middle, you have a good life, and I've had a fantastic life. So, you know, it's not easy to start out, but stick at it.
Isobel, I think you wanted to come in on that.
Thanks, Sally. I mean, yeah, really briefly, because I think it completely builds on James's end point. I agree, stick at it, because I think a lot of the actions that we've spoken about today that we know are going to be necessary in order to halt and reverse biodiversity loss will create jobs over the future. And so even if there's not an immediate rush immediately post May after COP15, we know that over the coming decades there's going to be a huge upscaling of this sector, and that will create jobs. So I think do stick at it. There'll be opportunities coming down the line, and we need people to be in those jobs, especially young people and more diverse people as well. So absolutely.
Thank you, Richard.
One thing I should briefly have said on the previous question was that sustainable use has crept in right at the top of the 2030 mission in the COP15 text. So just to keep dragging it back to COP15, that's a shame, because obviously it's really important that people, particularly in developing countries, are able to enjoy the same growth and development opportunities that we have. We want it to be on a different pattern. And by sort of highlighting sustainable use, we risk not emphasizing the point about beyond GDP and reducing resource use that's so important. But on this question of jobs, don't wait for COP15. Don't wait for COP15. It's going to take ages. There are real opportunities now. We should, of course, be reiterating the green jobs message in the run-up to next budget cycle and spending review. There's been some brilliant work by the likes of the National Trust showing how many jobs can be created by investment in urban parks, for example, and quality of life. But even sooner than that, right now, the DEFRA business planning is happening for how it implements the Environment Act. And it's going to be absolutely crucial, if that's going to be done properly, that local authorities are properly resourced and backed up by ecologists to do the sort of mapping and monitoring work to make sure that change happens on the ground. DEFRA knows this, DLUC knows this, but they really need to be pushed to invest in that local authority resource for ecologists and green jobs to help things like local nature recovery strategies and net gain work. So here in this country, there's a big opportunity. So get writing to DLUC and DEFRA and make sure that they're hearing the message that we need loads more independent and expert ecologists. I'd really like to hear Sally's bit on this too, so I'll shut up.
Absolutely. I just very quickly absolutely agree that there's going to be a big growth in the green jobs for nature market. Absolutely agree. We need to really push on now and get the investment in those jobs and not wait for anything really. We just need to get on and do it. But I also think we need to be making sure that there's a greater diversity of routes into those green jobs. And we do need to try and address this disconnect between leaving formal education and getting a job, and that whole requirement to do a work placement or volunteer to kind of earn your spurs before you get a job, because that excludes a lot of people. So I'm really keen that we do tackle this issue. It's a great profession to be in. There's going to be a huge opportunity. We need to be attracting a wide and diverse audience to those jobs, and we need to be making it practically effective and workable for people to get into them. You know, that's one of my key priorities, one of CIEEM's key priorities in the coming months and years. We are going to have to draw to a close there. Thank you so much to our panel, to Isobel and to James and to Richard. You've been brilliant, and I've really enjoyed it. It's been a very interesting discussion, and I've got a number of new phrases to use as a result of it, which is always excellent to come away from an event such as this with. Just a reminder that the webinar has been recorded and it will be added to our YouTube channel and to the CIEEM website in the Resources Hub. And also a reminder that the next webinar, the second webinar on COP15, will take place on next Thursday, 2nd of December. You can book that through the events tab on the CIEEM website. And that will focus in particular on some of the issues we've touched on today around financing and resourcing and so on. But it's been a brilliant discussion. Thank you all very much. I hope all those listening have enjoyed it, and enjoy the rest of your day. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.